A real expert in statistics thinks about rankings in universities. They're made up numbers that have no measure of anything of relevance to the performance of the university.
But one thing I find quite interesting as well in this world of change that we're in, and this podcast is called Relearning Work, because we have to not just rethink about work, we have to relearn it.
We need to recognise that being conscious that we're competent through a certificate that we might have is inevitably going to be followed by us becoming incompetent. Sounds harsh, but changes in skills, changes in work, changes in technology means that any competence we had won't remain competence that will serve us forever in the future.
Welcome to another episode of Relearning Work, where we dive into the future of learning and work. In each episode, we bring you conversations with leaders from industry and education to challenge assumptions, propose ideas, and share learnings, as we all navigate this world that is being reshaped by agentic AI. Whether you're an educator, a student, or a business executive looking to stay ahead of this rapidly changing landscape, there is something here for you. I'm your host, David Yip. My guest today is Dr. Martin Betts, co-founder of HEDx, one of the most influential voices in global higher education transformation. Martin brings over 40 years of academic and senior leadership experience, including roles as Deputy Vice Chancellor of Engagement and Executive Dean of STEM disciplines at universities across the UK, Asia, and Australia. He now works as an academic advisor and visiting professor to universities and companies around the world. In 2020, Martin co-founded HEDx as a central point for higher education innovation and leadership, including his influential podcast and conference. He has also authored 3 books outlining his principles and strategies to transform higher education, including Changing Higher Education for Good, The New Leadership Agenda, and The New Learning Economy. Through his work, Martin has challenged thinking and takes action to address inequalities in race, gender, and class while exploring new opportunities for transformation created by technological advances, demand changes, and partnership opportunities. Welcome, Martin.
Nice to see you, David. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's lovely to be a guest on someone else's podcast, particularly yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I've been a loyal listener for your podcast since towards the end of COVID, I should say, when I first came across it. And I found it to be particularly insightful. You have some amazing guests and some really, really good insights from very regular episodes. And I think it's quite a big gathering now, quite a big following, I should say, across all walks of life, not just academics, but also in the technology industry as well and business. So congratulations for, I think it's 5 years now, right, for the HEDx podcast?
It is. It's we started HEDx in 2020, as you say, just as COVID took real hold around the world. And more than 200 episodes later with leaders throughout Australia, throughout Asia Pacific, throughout the US and Europe and the UK have really given insights not only through leaders of universities, but also leaders of employer companies and technology companies, just around the changes that COVID was an accelerator of. And with AI and other things that I'm sure we'll talk about today, the even more pronounced changes that continue to build upon that as we go through what the world's looking like 5 years later. It's a very interesting time.
Yeah, I must say these last 5 years, it's just so transformational. A lot of the things that we've been talking about for a long time, well before these 5 years, are just now being accelerated, being amplified. It's actually real now. I remember talking about AI, before COVID, and at that time it was like something in a distant future. And now we're living it, we're using it, we're being impacted by it, some in a good way, some in not so good way. But this is a very interesting world that we live in now. And your podcast has been right at the beginning of this dramatic change. Now, one thing that I do want to explore in my podcast with all my guests as well is During times of change and transformation, there are lots of opportunities, right? But in terms of recognizing or even seeing the opportunities that might be right in front of you, you got to have the right mindset. And getting into the right mindset requires, understanding assumptions that we're making day in, day out, and sometimes assumptions we're making we might even be aware of. So, talking to so many leaders in different fields, what are some of these assumptions that you think people might be making, whether they're aware of it or not, that is so fundamental in getting into the right type of mindset?
Well, I think you've hit the part of that issue, and you're describing it in asking the question and that introduction, really, David. That if I think back over what I can recall my state of mind being as I left the sector 5 years ago, and the sort of conversations and the groundswell of thinking and of opinions in the heart and the heights of COVID, and what they've gone on to be 5 years later, as we're now 2 years into the very amplified and accelerated AI and agentic AI revolution. I think there's been a long period of stability and relatively slow change in opinions and in leadership and in models and in thinking in higher education in Australia, but around the world, that got really jolted by the activities of 2020. And they've, in many cases, become unstable through that jolting, to the point that everything that's happened in the more recent part of that last 5 years has just stimulated that instability even further and created more and more waves of change. But looking back over 5 years of my conversation with leaders, I sense that there's two phenomena about that phenomena of change that's gone on. One being that the general understanding, appreciation, and acceptance of change has moved on. I think leaders as a whole in the sector in 2025 are more accepting that the world is changing and we can't go back to 2019 and earlier than they were at the time of 2020. So the average has moved forward to accept more of change. But you've talked about it, an opportunity in change for leadership and for the world of learning. I think there is great opportunity, and I think at the end of that 5 years, there are an increasing number that are accepting that and embracing that opportunity and leading change. But I feel a dichotomy between those leaders and those catalysts and those pursuers of change, and those that are maybe becoming the outliers of not accepting it, being reluctant to lead change in their own institution, and whether they're scared of or unable to take themselves and their institution through the bold steps that are needed to keep up with the pace of change now or not. I feel that while the average has moved forward, we've got leaders of change that are taking great opportunities and resistors of change that are putting themselves into some quite vulnerable
Yeah,
positions.
yeah, absolutely. I think you're definitely right there. The leaders of change are driving forward and producing some amazing examples that people are following and showcasing. But one thing I find quite interesting as well in this world of change that we're in, and this podcast is called Relearning Work, because we have to not just rethink about work, we have to relearn it because things are just changing so rapidly, right? And relearning implies, you have to know something and then apply it and then use it as well. But education institutions, universities, TAFEs, education institutions, these are the institutions for learning, right? But it's a bit of a paradox, right? That these institutions tend to be the slowest to actually learn themselves to adapt. Why is that?
It is a paradox, isn't it? We celebrate knowledge, excellence, and technology and science in institutions. And yet, I'm sure you know from your former life in a technology providers and companies serving the sector that the sector might be great at advancing science and knowledge and technology, but its propensity to apply it is paradoxically sometimes restrained and sometimes slow. And I think we're an interesting mix of cultures and philosophies in higher education institutions, in that we celebrate new knowledge and discovery and advancement, but we have traditions and customs and practices and cultures reflective of the fact that we're a 1,000-year-old model that values longevity and tradition and prestige, which is somewhat a barrier to the adoption of the science, technology, and advancements and discoveries that we celebrate individual examples of so much. And so I think that tension between those two things has been something that higher education institutions, notably universities, have been able to navigate when change wasn't so rapid. And I think they're rapidly entering a period where holding that all together by celebrating the advancements but keeping the old models just isn't sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. And when you say sort of celebrating the advancements and the knowledge, and all the breakthroughs in science and everything else, I think you mentioned, or you quoted someone saying that universities are admiring the problem that they're seeing, admiring the disruption, admiring all this change happening around them. How are they taking action or not taking action when they see these problems?
Yeah, well, that quote that I've used a lot is one that you and I probably heard it together at the same time. It was the UA conference in Canberra in the start of 2025, and it was Catherine Livingstone, who ends her term at the end of 2025 as the Chancellor of UTS in Sydney, who talked about the sector being great at admiring its problems and not quite so open to solving them. And I think that I almost felt a gasp in the room of 1,000 people when she said that, as we all recognise that, yeah, we're really good at talking about change that is going on and whether it should be or not and what it should be, but making that change happen and enacting it
Mm,
is a different challenge, one that perhaps as academics that have become leaders, we've been less well prepared and trained and learnt how to undertake. And I think we're struggling broadly as a sector with our leaders in leading change at a time when it couldn't have been more important and more necessary.
yeah. But it is one of these things that's really hard to do because it deals with people's identity of themselves. Often, when you're in a particular field, you're an expert, you're recognized as a leader in the field, but all of a sudden this this AI thing comes about and does what you've been doing in seconds. And you got to relearn what it means to be a researcher or a teacher or an administrator, right? That's pretty difficult. It must be pretty confronting. But also, how would you even respond to that as a leader to support the rest of the organization? Because you have to, right? You can't just leave people behind. You can't just force it upon people. You have to support everyone and provide the opportunities to relearn your specialty area or find new ones.
Absolutely, and I think the best way of doing that is leading by example and being a role model of change. I was in a recent conversation with one leader that I do admire in amongst the many leaders that I admire, but I'll give a shout out to Theo Farrell, the Vice Chancellor of La Trobe University. You'll be aware that he hosted a conference for HEDx in the early part of 2025 in Melbourne, soon after La Trobe had declared itself to be on a strategy along with its partners in tech companies to be an AI first university.
Mm,
An interesting concept, one that's been used by other people in North America as well. Lots of discussion of what that means. And in lots of interactions with Theo around that conference and since, I know that when Theo's presented with something to do, his first inclination is to use AI personally,
mm,
to do it as quickly as he can, as productively as he can, and as effectively as he can. And because he portrays that willing, he's a professor of war and strategy from King's College and then Wollongong and
mm,
prestigious, long established universities from around the world. I don't think he'll be the first to probably admit that he doesn't have a training in AI,
mm.
but he's got a mindset of he's going to put it first. He's going to learn how to use it, and he's going to apply it and let others see him as a leader using it
Yeah.
at any opportunity. And I think that mindset, that willingness to embrace change, and that willingness to take something on is a great skill to have and a great quality to exhibit in a time when relearning is so important to everybody.
Yeah. I think there's two things you mentioned there. Doing it yourself and learning new skills and taking on new kinds of ways of working, but also making it very visible, exhibiting it. Using your word, exhibiting that to the rest of the organization. That is so important, so people see you. doing it. So, it's not just telling people that they have to use AI or should use AI, but actually they're seeing you use AI and benefits of it, and potentially even seeing mistakes that you're making using AI, and that it's okay to do that because that's how we learn, right? You can't learn by being perfect all the time.
Absolutely not. I mean, I can liken this to my own experience, David. You mentioned that 5 years ago I started a podcast. That was after a lot, nearly 40 years working in senior leadership roles, eventually after senior academic roles and junior academic roles in universities around the world. And when I stepped out of being a deputy vice chancellor with my army of resources and staff and reports around me, I realized then that in that first few weeks by myself, the skills I lacked in being able to embrace new technology to do new things only really became apparent to me because I'd masked them up until then by hiding behind other people that I could ask to do things. As a deputy vice chancellor in the university, I used to swear about the IT department all the time until I was the IT department.
Yeah, yeah,
And then I
yeah,
realized how hard it was and how little I knew. And then suddenly you're thrust into trying to start a podcast and develop your own websites and run CRM systems and run social media campaigns with no one to call to come and do it for you.
yeah,
You learn very quickly that relearning is the most important thing that you have to do.
yeah. Well, I guess go deeper into the mindset shift because I think that's really key. What you've done, over the last 5 years, and that shift from a large institution, lots of resources, senior role into something that you're creating, your own brand. So your brand is not associated with a large institution anymore. Your brand is yourself. For a lot of people, that's a pretty scary proposition, right? Especially when you've reached the top of the large organizations, to venture out and create something from scratch that's yourself. What kind of mindset do you have to get into, and how do you make that switch? Probably that's the second question is probably more important. How do you make that switch?
I might actually take issue with you and disagree with you there in that I think it was Clark Kerr of University of California who I might not get his quote exactly right, but I'm sure we've all heard it before and identified with it that a university is as a collection of professors who are independent entrepreneurs bound together by a common interest in car parking. Um,
Yeah.
I think back to my career as a professor and a researcher, and then as a head of school and a dean and a deputy vice chancellor and a leader. And I think many professors and academic leaders in universities think they are their own brand. They do identify with the University of Calathumphia or Southern Northwestern New South Wales when they have to and when it suits them, but they've had training of building up their own reputation and their own prestige, but they've done it within an environment of specialization,
Hmm.
specialization of narrow sets of skills in what they're really expert in, with a supportive environment of a large institution that assists them establishing that brand. Now, for me, um, I was probably on the spectrum of being even more my own lone rider in some of my early academic career, building my own brand within my universities than some other professors. But I didn't find myself acquiring the technological marketing and other skills that I've had to in the last 5 years in establishing HEDx because a university was such a rich environment of resources to do that in. I think universities have changed a lot more in the last 5 years than they did in maybe the 10 to 20 before that. And I actually sense that there's an awful lot of academics and professional staff working in higher education institutions now that our universities are stretched. They don't have the resources anymore. And the resources that are there are struggling to keep up with the technological advancement and the demand. So increasingly university staff, academic and professional, are being left on their own. And I think whether you're trying to do that as your sub brand within a university, as a full alignment with the brand of your institution, or out in a startup with a new company, that the skills that all of us need are how to stay ahead of the technology, how to stay ahead of the changes in skills, how to stay ahead of the markets that we're dealing with, and learn how to learn ourselves. And you've mentioned mindset. I think the most important starting point to be able to do what I've just described well is recognizing and being conscious being conscious of that competence in some of those issues being your concern and something only you can deal with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To solve a problem, you first have to recognize there is a problem, right? You got to recognize it first, and then you can go you build a plan for it, and then you can go and educate yourself and find resources and take action. Yeah,
But
around that.
I could just elaborate on that if you like, David, in that you referred to the three books that I'd worked on. One of them I wrote with a former colleague of mine, a good friend of mine called Michael Roseman from QUT, and it was the New Learning Economy book. And the starting point of that book is this concept of consciousness of competence. And it's the Donald Rumsfeld quote of unknown unknowns beyond known knowns and known unknowns that's behind that sort of categorization. I think much of global higher education and learning has worked on the assumption too much up until now that we go to education to become competent. We get a certificates and put it on our wall that means that we know and everyone else knows that we are competent. And then we practice for the rest of our career. I think for 1,000 years, that was the model. I think definitely in the last 5 years, but for a period running up to that and increasingly in the time ahead, we need to recognize that being conscious that we're competent through a certificate that we might have is inevitably going to be followed by us becoming incompetent. Sounds harsh, but changes in skills, changes in work, changes in technology means that any competence we had won't remain competence that will serve us forever in the future. And that first step is to become unconsciously incompetent.
Hmm.
Really dangerous position to be in.
Hmm.
First step to solving it is to become conscious of what you don't know.
Hmm.
And then the step is to go out and know what you do need to know to be competent in the future.
Yeah, yeah.
And that cycle of unconscious or conscious competence to unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence to re-establishing consciousness of what we know through relearning is a cycle that not only we'll go through once in our career, but we'll be going through it every a shorter and shorter period throughout our working lives. And unless we adopt that mindset, we're ill prepared for the future of work.
And that mindset that we need to adopt. I talk about the five skills, the 5 C's for this agentic AI world, beginning with curiosity, right? Curiosity, critical thinking, creativity, communications, collaboration. But we start with curiosity because once you start with curiosity, then you can actually ask questions and you can uncover that where you're not so competent in, or what kind of new knowledge you need to pick up on, or what's really interesting that's making some changes around you. The curiosity mindset spurs you to come and learn new things, right? That's the starting point. Without being curious, how would you start learning, right?
And I don't
You got to
think
ask the question first. You got to ask the question first.
completely agree, David. And I'm not sure that being curious and being, if curious equates to being admitting a lack of certainty and lacking that or accepting that you don't know, I'm not sure that academic training and the reward and value systems of the 1,000-year old model of academia has been that there is an element of celebrating curiosity, but there's also a lot of stepping stones, milestones, and recognition associated with achievement and certainty.
Mm, mm,
And I fear that too many of the routes towards leadership in our system in the past have been celebrations of people knowing
mm,
and being competent
mm,
and not needing to be curious at a time where I think you're right. We've never had a greater need for leaders that accept uncertainty and the need for being able to hold their hands up and admit that they don't know and they need to find out.
I think part of that also is knowledge used to be something really, really valuable, takes a long time to discover and find and whatnot. But with the new technologies that we have, with AI advances, literally every other week there's some new breakthroughs, new ways of doing things. Knowledge is becoming really, really easy to generate almost sometimes, right? Now people are talking about, you know, uh, building an AI scientist to really autonomously go and make new discoveries. I think that's not in a not too distant future. They'll probably become real. In an age where knowledge becomes relatively straightforward to get and quite easy to get, asking questions becomes probably the more valuable bit. Because the harder thing is to know what questions to ask questions. And I think the focus on knowledge, focus on answers, solutions, that's been the focus of the system for a long, long time. We almost have to flip it around, back into Socratic days, and long, long time ago, people focused on the questioning part. I think that needs to be brought back into the fore to be able to question the answers that we're getting, question the really eloquent responses that ChatGPT gives us. That sounds really, really good. It might be pretty good in most parts, but some parts of it isn't. But we need to be able to find out which parts isn't, right? And that's
I
hard.
think.
It's
Yeah, I think you're really on the money there, David. And again, much of the culture of universities and of higher education of learning has been about being able to answer questions rather than ask them, and knowing what the answers are. And that underpins much of our approach to research, developing content that universities feel that they have to own out of their researchers to then share with and impart upon their students and learners. And our whole approach to assessment being checking that people know answers rather than testing their ability to ask questions. I think the whole model of learning and of higher education institutions being the places where knowledge is developed and imparted by owning the content, and the place that you come to get answers is fundamentally being undermined by changes in technology and the broader ecosystem. And if a curious leader is able to navigate a transformation of these institutions and its communities of people to be the places that can inculcate in its learners, lifelong learners, the ability to ask questions and know how to find and assess good content wherever it comes from. Those that do that well will thrive in the period ahead. Those that don't do it well or don't even accept that that's what they need to do are really under a threat of vulnerability, I think.
so really what we're talking about when we're talking about relearning work in the context of, I guess, the education system or the tertiary system is relearning how to learn, right? The aspect of learning is the actual work, right? And that in itself is a bit of a concept to get your head around, because it's flipping the old model upside down, relearning how to learn. In fact, how do you think the model today equips us how to learn versus the product of learning?
Well, I think for the reasons that we've already covered in the conversation bit so far, I don't think it's well equipped to do that at all. And I don't think it's been a priority for many higher education institutions, particularly universities, to be mindful of that and to want to understand that. I think because there's been an assumed model of learning and an assumed certainty of competence being what universities sell and trade.
Mm.
The focus of universities has been on something else. It's been on their prestige, it's been on their research and what that leads to what they achieve in their rankings. It's been on a whole bunch of other things. And I don't know that there's as many universities that have focused on understanding and evolving for a future that needs it, new models of learning and relearning, as we will now need in the period ahead.
I think almost the act of learning itself, um, certainly in my observations and also experience as well, is it's kind of a given that a student going through a system will figure that out, right? You give them some assignment, you give them a test, you give them a project, and you get them to come up with an answer, and through the process they will figure out how to learn. And but I don't think that's going to work, because some students might do that, yes, but I'm not sure everyone will learn how to learn. They might stumble across the answer somehow. You really have to get into advanced degrees like masters and PhDs, where you really get into learning how to learn, right? Being curious, discoveries, that kind of thing. But that's only a small part of the population that go on and do advanced degrees, right? Most just stop at the bachelor's, and there's not enough emphasis on asking questions, learning how to learn. You know, we almost have to bring the PhD kind of teaching and learning all the way back into the bachelor's, right? That should be the new work model, really. After all, Sam Altman keeps talking about PhD level AIs that you get for free or $20 a month or whatever it is. We need to bring that back into the bachelor, the first stage of tertiary education, not the final stage.
I think you're right there, and I think much of the explanation of the problem that you're uncovering in your description there, I think, comes from the fact that we started off higher education, university education, being the domain of the few who are well equipped, because they usually came from the more well-off parts of our society and our more developed economies and countries, to come and experience the wonder of knowledge in our universities, where we had great scholars making progress in research, developing content that you could only find in that university, and being able to work out themselves how to learn and to relearn in that environment with that content. And look, it's served us well for a very long time, but it's not going to serve the world of the next 50 years, of the next 5 years. We increasingly higher education has gone beyond being the domain of the 5 to 10% of the very highest educated, most capable self-learners for a small number of, elevated professional roles to, the UK some time ago set an ambition of 50% of the cohort getting a higher education. Jason Clare in Australia in the Accord over the last couple of years is setting the goal of 80% of Australians having some exposure to tertiary education. It's gone from being the domain of the few to being needed by the majority. And once you go from 5 to 10% to 50 to 80%, you go beyond the affluent, well-supported, already competent self-learners to a completely different demographic of mature, often low SES, often multiple intersectional diversity groups that have acute needs for their own mental well-being, financial well-being, multiple well-beings, their own welfare. In many cases, they're suffering poverty and the lack of food. And telling such people they need to learn to work out how to learn and you're lucky to be here is just not going to cut it. And I think we've got an opportunity here because if we have, I don't know if AI scientists are going to work, but if we have technologies advancing to the point where we don't need a huge academic workforce that all needs to do unique research to develop content that it needs to share with learners. Instead, we have the opportunity of that cohort relearning how to become experts in how to help a broader section of our society learn how to learn.
Mm, yeah. Absolutely.
And
I think you're definitely right there. There's a huge workforce in the sector. And yes, there is definitely going to be the need to find new knowledge, make discoveries, but not everyone needs to do that, particularly with AI, boosting productivity and effectiveness. But, there is a huge need to disseminate that new knowledge and be able to teach a huge population how to learn explicitly, intentionally teach them how to learn and cultivate the environment that people want to learn new things and find new things and curate that content for them. Now, talking to so many leaders, not just in Australia, but around the world, what are some really standouts of institutions or leaders that's actually doing something that you see really brings these kind of concepts to life? Because yeah, they are quite conceptual as we talk about it, but how can we put it into some real tangible examples that our listeners can actually relate to or find out more about?
yeah, well, I think I've been so lucky to talk to more than 200 leaders around the world over 5 years. And increasingly, as those 5 years have gone on, I've gone from making my targets of leaders to talk to go from people close to home that I sort of knew and knew what they'd have to say to finding tendrils through to new networks that I'd never heard of before, of people that I'd never known before, but have come to the fore through the word of mouth of others as being the great examples that I should find out about. And look, I mean, all 200 of the people that I've spoken to have been really eye-opening with what they've had to say. But I'll quote a couple of those that have been very impactful on my thinking. They're two North American presidents of universities that I now recognize completely as universities. I spent a lot of time in 2025 in the US and in the UK and traveling around the world in Europe, in Singapore too. And I spent a lot of time with my wife's network in the US asking peers of mine, parents of kids of our own kids' age, what they thought of these two universities. And they'd never heard of them
Mhm.
because they weren't the sort of places that wealthy, educated families like my family, my wife's family, and their families would think of sending their 18-year-old kids to in the very competitive and very reputation conscious North American university market, where everyone knows about Stanford and Berkeley, and everyone knows about UCLA and California Institute of Technology. Everyone knows about Harvard and MIT. And people are starting to hear about places like ASU. But the two leaders that I want to use as examples to answer your question are Scott Pulsifer and Paul LeBlanc, respectively, of Western Governors University and Southern New Hampshire University. Now, as I say, when I mentioned those two places to a lot of our friends in the Bay Area or in New York State, they've not heard of them, and yet they vie for. You've heard of them. A lot of the listeners to this podcast might have heard of them because they vie for being the largest online universities in the world. And let me leave the online element of that out a little bit. They're also very different universities in terms of the leaders that they have and the missions that they have, and that they're not trying to break into the top rankings of research prestige universities. They're
Or
trying
the
to
the traditional rankings. The traditional
no,
rankings. Yeah.
they're also not trying to break into the college football team league tables by having the best college football team, and they haven't even got a stadium or a football team. They'd see that as a distraction and a waste of money from the primary purpose of educating as many people who would otherwise not go to universities to become competent with the skills that are necessary for a future workforce. So Scott Pulsifer and Western Governors University, for me, a fascinating story in that Scott is the most unusual but likable and impressive and noteworthy of university presidents, and that he's never worked at a university before he became president of one. He was the chief operating officer of Amazon. He's a technologist, he's a business person, and he understands how to get technology to transform to the digital era a major service providing company to meet the needs of its governors and its governing body to make education available to more future learners, to allow them to be employable in the future workforce. And what he's done to build a university of 250,000 learners with a university campus that has no academics working on it, doing research, no football team, but a bunch of specialist learning supporters helping people learn how to learn to deliver education to single mums, to returning vets, to mature age lifelong learners with not a 17-year-old from a high school anywhere near their learning environments to a significant extent. It is a very different story of the new learning economy from what you'd see at Stanford or UCLA or Harvard or Berkeley. Um, so that would be one example. The other example I'd quote is someone that I know that you've interviewed on your podcast, David. We both have on our podcast. I think for both of us, he's one of the few people that ended up having to be spread over two episodes rather than one on each of our podcasts because he has got so much interesting stuff to say. I'd have to say he's one of the greatest, most inspiring leaders that I've ever encountered. Is Paul LeBlanc, who until recently was the president of Southern New Hampshire University, which is a very similar story to Western Governors. Paul's quite a different character to Scott. He's been a lifetime academic, but he chose to be a president of a very different university. He could have been in an Ivy League university. Indeed, he's worked in Ivy League universities in his past, but he's got the most pronounced of social conscience values, streaks in his beliefs and his personality, to recognize that innovation and making education available to all, and making that based on competence rather than outdated models that most universities follow, inspired him to build in southern New Hampshire, again, one of the most inspiring examples of democratization of access to knowledge and really highly advanced support for learners to learn how to learn, that I think make those two examples standouts of the new learning economy and the new way that we might conceive of growth in learning and higher education in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, those, I completely agree. Those two examples fly underneath the radar because they are so different to the traditional model. You mentioned rankings a few times, and I think the whole system of ranking. I think ranking is important, by the way. That's my own personal opinion, but I think the current rankings that universities are usually reliant on, I think what the general public thinks about the rankings, there's a bit of a disconnect and mismatch. I think when a 17, 18-year-old, looks at a rank, they think the rank means something that's quite different to how the I guess universities, the system itself measures. I'm not sure how many people really understand how these rankings. It's more arcane mathematics and criteria really. Um, but you mentioned employability around in Western governors as well. Research papers and things like that are form a large part of rankings in the traditional environment. But Southern New Hampshire, Western governors, and quite a number of others, their impact is and focus is quite different. You mentioned mature age, returning veterans, and people want to reskill to change careers. You know, I think there needs to be a different, or there is, but I guess widely adopted different kind of ranking systems for employability and skills and real career impact outcomes rather than academic and research outcomes.
Oh, I wish you wouldn't dangle the rankings carrot
I think that's
or
a whole new podcast, a whole new episode, definitely.
don't don't get
Maybe
me
I've opened a can
started,
of worms
David.
there.
I mean, look, I'll just cut to the chase. I think rankings are at best invalid. And just ask a statistical expert like Adrian Barnett at QUT what a real expert in statistics thinks about rankings in universities. They're made up numbers that have no measure of anything of relevance to the performance of a university.
It's a great marketing tool, though, because a lot of people choose universities based on their rank.
Well, I don't doubt that they're effective. I'm just questioning their validity in the through the lens of a statistical expert. But I'd go further and say that at worst, they are a major hindrance to innovation and change in universities. Something that's measuring what you did and what the outcomes from it were 25 years ago, and makes the dominance of its measures about historical and conventional and yesterday's principles of effectiveness, is in itself a barrier to innovation and change. We should get rid of them at as the earliest opportunity.
Yeah, I agree.
And,
What needs
and
to
we'll
change, though?
only get rid of them if we replace them with the sort of things that you're talking about, which are valid and relevant measures of things that matter to us, not to a commercial ranking
Yeah,
company.
absolutely. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I do want to ask about the skills and the talents for this new workforce. So, yes, we've spoken about the types of institutions and the some of the challenges, but the new workforce. We mentioned curiosity. We mentioned you have to be aware of your competence and areas of incompetence and things like that. But what other skills do people need to have in order to thrive? Not just be able to navigate and you know get work or operate in the new AI economy, but thrive to really be able to get new opportunities, flourish in exciting careers they may not have even thought about. Right? What kind of skills do you think is needed?
I think this is one of the most intriguing aspects of how the change over very recent times has become at odds with what our assumptions had been over much of the last 20 years or so. And that I think what we've seen over much of that last 20 years is a STEM revolution, a big focus on science and technology and mathematics and the importance of information, the importance of engineering, the importance of health sciences and the like, which has been to the detriment of, or really as an alternative to, things that have become judged to be unimportant in the creative arts, in the humanities, and the social sciences. And in Australia, we really made a complete stuff up of this with the Job Ready graduates package, where we decided that all we needed was scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, and we didn't need anyone that was in danger of having too much humanity in their views about anything. Priced our university education accordingly. Luckily, most students don't pay any attention to it, and it hasn't skewed too much of the choices that have been made, but it's had huge impacts on the financial exposure to students making wise choices. Because I think what we've seen with the emergence of AI over the last 2 or 3 years has been an acceleration of our understanding that technology itself can do so many of the things that we might have wanted so many STEM graduates to become expert in. And actually, the skills that we'll need more and more in the next 2, 5, 20 years are social skills, skills in the humanities, skills in being able to ethically and with compassion and with sensitivity and with the ability to interact with other people, apply technology for useful purposes for our fellow human beings. And the technology will be able to assist great, compassionate, and socially aware, thoughtful workforces of the future to do that in a way that serves the needs of people. So, yes, we need people with the right mindsets. Do we really need lots of people that can code really well in the future if we've got AI technologies that can do it for us? Maybe we still need a lot of those, but I think we'll definitely need more people with human touch, with the ability to operate ethically and the ability to interact with other people really well. And they're the things that we should focus on in our education in the future.
Absolutely, and really get the balance right. It's not one or the other. It's an and. We can't be completely just focused and resourcing and just emphasize STEM. It's important, but it's not the be all and end all. We need to have the humanities, the arts, and arguably even more so in the world of AI, the human skills relating to others. And these we have to have programs that are that intentionally and explicitly teach students how to communicate, how to collaborate, and not just hope that it just happens. Which is I think is something maybe to look for in innovative institutions. So wrapping up now, one question I do ask all my guests as well, being an education podcast, is an influential teacher or a mentor, or it could be a manager, someone, Martin, that has really influenced you in your life and what you've done. So who would be that teacher that's made an impact in your life, and why?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways of interpreting a question like that, David. So I'm intrigued to think what I would prefer to answer that with. In that, we've all had really influential teachers in our early years, haven't we, that have really inspired us. I was lucky enough to have a teacher at my high school who saw potential in me that others didn't see, and I didn't see in myself, who pulled me back from the brink of getting myself into trouble lots of times. I still am in touch with him as he lives around the corner from where my parents lived in Colchester now, in England. And Eddie Ross will always go down in my books as the most influential of role models and teachers and mentors. I've mentioned professionally a couple of people like Scott Pulsifer and perhaps even more so Paul LeBlanc as being outstanding leaders. But I think what we each do in our lives is also very personally driven by our family and personal experiences. And two people in my family, they've both passed away. My father passed away a couple of years ago, and my sister passed away 10 years ago. And much of my drive for doing what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do comes around recognizing that as one of two children in my family, I was really lucky in being able to grow up in an era where early selection with an 11 plus, and being male and going down a grammar school route rather than a secretarial or a vocational education route that my sister had led to so much advantage for me when higher education was the exclusive domain of a few. And when my sister passed, I really looked back on our respective lives and thought how much I wish she had had the chance to not have been, discriminated against for her gender, for other aspects of her life, and deselected from that route of exposure to lifelong learning from an early age. And that drives me to be the rationale for the purpose that I drive. And, my mother and father were huge influences on my life. My mother's still alive and inspires me every day. My father was a fireman. We grew up in a fire station. He was a man of action. He when the alarm bells rang, in contrast to my life in a university, he did not set up a working party to develop some terms of reference to come up with an initial green paper for consultation, and a year down the line potentially make some recommendations to academic board and council. He instead got on a fire engine and drove as quickly as possible to an incident and tried to save lives. And it's difficult to exactly follow his role model and leadership and example in change in higher education, but I'm sure glad that I don't have to do terms of reference for academic boards and university councils anymore. And I'd like to, like I know you would, like to see more change in higher education to keep up with the pace of the rapid change and the rapid advances, accidents or otherwise, that are the danger for tomorrow's lifelong learners and the relearning that they need to do right now.
And with that, I get the sense, the urgency here. I think the fire and engine, the firefighter analogy is probably quite appropriate. This is actually happening very quickly, and we do need to do something really urgently about it. And I guess in industry, we talk about the burning platform. There is absolutely burning platform. With a lot of early career people, mid career people, the way AI is blazing through every single industry everywhere around the world. We do need to have that sense of urgency, the firefighting spirit, if you will, and go and do it. And really, saving lives sounds pretty dramatic, but in many ways it probably is. Because it is something that is going to be super impactful, and people get the opportunity to learn and relearn their work and contribute meaningfully in lots and lots of different opportunities. So thank you, Martin, for your insights and sharing what you've learned through hundreds of inspired conversations on your podcast and your travels, and coming on my podcast to do that. This last segment is about plugs. So Martin, this is more of a fun one and an opportunity to plug anything, anyone, just some organization or some initiative that you'd like to put a spotlight on that you think our audience should go and check out and learn more about.
I'm going to quote two examples. One's quite mature and one's very embryonic. And they're two people that have, alongside everything else that I've described, inspired me. One is the University of East London in the United Kingdom. I interviewed Amanda Broderick, the Vice Chancellor of that university, a little while ago. That's a university that went from being the most likely to financially fail in the UK 7 years ago to be University of the Year in 2025 through someone that decided to put students first and create a culture for our staff and students to make it happen. Go check it out. And the second one is a university that only launched in 2025. It's from someone that had come through the Southern New Hampshire University stable, and her name is Sasha Thackerbury Voinovich. She set up a brand new premium subscription priced model, fully online university for AI called New State University in the US. It only launched in July 2025. I've no idea how it's going, but I think for braveness, agility, for entrepreneurialism, I think if you've not heard of New State University or found out anything about it, and if you've not heard Sasha Thackerbury Voinovich talk about what it really means to be entrepreneurial, agile, and bold and brave, I'd love to give her a plug too.
Thank you, Martin. And so both will be in the show notes, so do check them out. And for myself, I would plug my business, Alumly, so alumly.work, ALUMLY .work. We're building Australia's first Earn While You Learn platform. And if you want to find out what that is, check out our website and follow us on socials and LinkedIn, because we are trying to solve a big gap in the marketplace. And with that, we'll come to the end of this episode. I look forward to sharing some more insights next time. Thank you.